Hi everyone, it's Mr. Barden here. I'm coming at you to talk about how we can add animations to our sprites and just utilize images in general using P5 Play and the P5 library and coding environment. So let's just hop right into it. As always, I'll have a link to this sketch that I make during this video in the description, as well as any additional resources. So hopefully I won't repeat myself by saying it's in the description too many times, but you will find out. Okay. So if we start here, I've got a sketch that it has a sprite loaded, and I've also preemptively made the canvas a very specific size. What we're going to start with is just the basics of loading an image. And then we'll start talking about how we can use that with P5 a little bit later. So what we need to do in order to load an image into our P5 sketch is click on this little triangle right over here, this little arrow, I should say. And this is going to open up the sketch files. I'm hesitant to call it an interface or a finder or even a window. It barely does anything, but it's very useful at the same time. I wish there was a little more functionality, like being able to move files once you've uploaded them. But, you know, I'm not the one making it. So what we need to do is where it says sketch files, click on the little triangle right here. Don't click on the identically sized formatted and placed triangles. I can't even talk today. Underneath it next to these files, because that's not what we want. It has to be this one right up here. I have a lot of opinions about this little file browser. Generally, it's just not very user-friendly. But if we click on it, and for some reason this is just named triangle, if you hover over it, we have a few options. We can upload a file, which is fine. You can start that from now, but I'm going to show you kind of an extra step, which I think makes life a lot easier. And instead, I'm going to go to create folder. If you're making additional JavaScript or HTML files, this is also where you would add that. But I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to give it a name, images. And we'll add it right there. So the folder has popped up right here on the screen. It's got the name we give it, great. This bigger triangle over here, if it's pointing down, then the folder is open and we'll be able to see all of the files inside of it. There's nothing inside it right now. But if we click it and it changes, then the folder is closed and it won't display all the stuff inside. To add something to the folder, you have to click on the triangle next to the folder's name. If you just click up here and say add file, it's not going to put the files into your sketches. So just be aware, or I should say, it's not going to put the files into the folder. That's the real word there. And if you picked up on this when I said it earlier, once you've loaded a file, the only way to change where it's saved here is to delete it and re-upload it. There's no way to move it around, and I'm not a fan of that. But that aside, I can spend days and days talking about things I don't like. You all came here to check out how to, do what it says in the video title. So I'm going to click next to here, and I'm actually going to make 2 more folders. Partly so you can see it done a few times, and also because of how I'm going to organize all this. So I'm going to make a folder, and we'll call this Sprite Annie for animations. And I'll, again, click on images because I want to put it in the images folder. We're going to make another one. We're just going to call it background. And why not? We'll be extra redundant. We'll actually make idle, and we'll make move, because those are the 2 we're going to do. So if you've seen, I'm just putting folders inside of folders inside of folders. This is very handy for organizing a bunch of files. As you'll see shortly, we're going to have a lot of files, and as the course goes on, it's going to increase more and more and more and more. So having this kind of folder architecture ready to go from the beginning makes your life a lot easier. So once I've got the folders I want to put the files in all sorted away, then we just have to go find the files. And I conveniently have, if you can see what's on my desktop right now, right here, all the files that we're going to use in today's video. So I'm just getting this ready to go. and then heading over here. So on background, I'm going to click next to there and we'll say upload file. And then I'm just going to use my background and just drag and drop it right there, and it'll pop up. It doesn't really go away right here, but once you see it pop up in the folder, then then you know it's there. You don't have to worry, but it's still there, even if it looks like it might still be uploading because of questionable design. And that's pretty much it. Now, again, I cannot move this file in any way. The only way to change where it's located is to rename it. Because, again, I can't just drag and drop it somewhere. That would have been too easy. But you can click on it, rename it, and I'm just going to make life easy. And we'll call it background to make life easy. So under sprite animations, I don't want to add it to the sprite Annie folder. I want to add these to the idle folder. So I'm going to upload a file, and I've got these animations right here. Each of these pictures of this little slime character is one frame in an animation. I'll talk about where I got these in just a moment because they're available for you all as well. But I like using the slime ones in my little lessons for my students, partly because it's just a cute little slime, also because all of the animations follow a very useful rule and they're all the same number of frames. So it just makes life a lot easier. So I'm going to take all the ones for the idle animation, and I'm going to select them. We can just control click to select them, and drag and drop. Boom, right there. I'll do the same thing, but by clicking on the move here, and then we'll upload file from move. Actually, I'll be redundant, and I'll close that. Upload file to the move folder, and we'll get the last one right there. So it's very handy, and a lot of times it's done, but not always, to name your animations accordingly to what they are and the frame in the animation. So these are all for the slime characters. So they all start with slime, and then the animation title, so you know where it's supposed to be, and then the frame number right there, so you know exactly what that file is supposed to be. That's all very handy things to have when you are making and using these sprite animations. I'm going to suggest that starting numbering them with 0 will save you a lot of time later, and I'm kind of in that camp, but you'll find a lot of them, if you look at resources online, don't necessarily start with 0. But you can rename these just by going next to the file, clicking the triangle, and clicking rename, just like we did with the background. So that's pretty useful. You may want to do that, especially if you just downloaded a file off the internet for class and you're trying to use it, and it's got this really long, generated name. Renaming it to something a bit easier will save you a bunch of headache. Okay. So before we actually start displaying the images, I just want to mention a few more small things. First off, there's a bunch of different ways you can find these sprite images. I'm more of a fan of when they're already kind of pre-separated right here into separate files, but a lot of times there's what's called a sprite sheet. And let's see if we can see one right down here. I'll talk about this in just a moment, but it's just a single file that has all of the images in the animation attached to it, and we can tell the computer just to look at a very specific portion of this image and display that as the frame. It's very handy, but it can go wrong very quickly if something's not spaced properly, things like that. It can be a bit of a bit problematic. So I prefer, like we have right here, where we're loading all of the images individually to build the animation ourselves. The other thing is that we've now attached these images to our P5 account. They're set there. These are our assets that we can use. Other people can't access the assets unless they get to your sketches and are looking through all of that. But if you click on your account and click on My Assets, I'm just going to open it in a new tab. you'll be able to see a list, it's taking a second to load, of all the assets that you have used in your account and what sketch they're attached to. So you can see the name, the file format, the size, where they are, all that. But every account only has 250 megabytes of total storage. So generally speaking, you're going to want to make your files as small as they can be, and then you'll start to update and change them, and so use them however you want. That's cool. But when you run out of space from all your files, you get to an issue. So again, I've got a much larger sound file here compared to some of these sprite images down there. It's gonna fill up, and when it gets full, you have to either make a new account or delete the old ones. Those are your options. So what we're going to see in just a second when we start loading up an image and using it, there's ways we can get around that, but they come with a few caveats. So I just wanted to bring that up now, so when I talk about it in just a second, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. So let's start with the background, because that's kind of the simplest one to start with. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a container to hold this sprite. So let's be let background image is what I tend to call mine. You can call it whatever, but it's just going to be a variable that's going to hold this image so we can use it in our sketch. I'm also going to introduce function preload right here. And I'm just going to briefly break down what it is. So preload, if you can't quite tell from the name, what it's doing is it is loading up resources before the sketch runs. So what you're going to use this for is to load up all of your images or sound sources or whatever you've got and get them ready to go before anything else in the sketch happens. And this will help avoid you trying to use something that hasn't properly loaded yet. This will become a lot more noticeable when we start doing audio, or if you do anything with video and just bigger file sizes. If you're just using these very small images, you may not notice a difference if you did this in setup. But I'm going to always pretty much do it in preload, because once we start doing more advanced things, you will get errors because something hasn't loaded yet, even though it should have. So let's hop into preload, and let's load up a background image. To do this, we just talk to that variable we just made. Background image. It's going to equal a new... it's not a new thing. I'm sorry. It's going to be load image. There we are. I was looking at line 10, and that's where I started typing when I saw load image. Now, this is all just in base P5. We haven't actually done anything other than putting this sprite on the screen that's using P5 play. So I wanted to make you aware we can load up all of these images without using P5 play, but once we start animating sprites, that's where that's going to start coming in. So all we have to tell it to do with load image is where to find the file. So we're going to do this as a string. So I've got my quotations here, and we're going to look and find the file pathway for all of these things. So all of our images are in a folder called images. So we'll start there. Slash, then we've got to find the subfolder. So we're going to background, BG. It's the name of that one. Slash, and then the file name and extension, bg.png, just like that. When we start loading up the other ones, this little file pathway will be different. I just want to note a few things. When you're going into a folder, that's when we need to use the slash to indicate where we're moving into, and you need to have the file extension. As a side note, if you happen to have a file that is hosted somewhere online, and these are done in various different ways, so I won't break down all of that right now because that's a whole topic in and of its own, but if you have a file hosted online, you can actually just put the URL for that image right here instead. This is very handy because it will, keep it so you're not utilizing your storage on your account and your devices and all that. You don't have to actually have the image But if the image is ever deleted or moved or just no longer able to be found, then your sketches will no longer work. Like, you won't be able to find the image because it's not at that exact URL on the internet anymore. This can be problematic because then you have to go find it and update it. But again, if that's easier for you to deal with than running out of the storage, then by all means go for it. I'm not going to tell you how to save your files. I prefer to load them up like this because then I'm the one controlling where they are, whether or not they've been changed or renamed or moved. I know, and then I can go update my code at the same time just so it's automatically just working. But I'll leave that up to you. Again, it's either the URL or the file pathway locally. From there, if we were to run this, you notice it may take just a second longer to load. The more things preload has to do, the longer it takes to get all the bits going. And it'll just say loading right here, but with only a few images, it's probably only going to be a few seconds at most for you. But now we just have to do something with the image. And I'm just going to replace, instead of drawing a color on the background, we're going to display the background image just like that. And there's the image. I'll move my face out of the way so you can see it in its entirety, and we'll kind of scroll over just a bit. There's the image right there. Cool. One thing to note is that in this particular case, with the background canvas, when we load an image onto it, the image will be squished and adjusted to fit the dimensions of the background. I've set this to match the background image just so you can see it by default, but if I put the canvas back at 400 by 400 and refreshed it, it all gets squished. So that's just something to be aware of. Figured I'd get a drink before I brought my camera back. Okay, so yeah, we'll leave it at that size just for now. But just know that it will be squished and stretched depending on your canvas dimensions. This will be different from a sprite. When we start adding images to a sprite, and I'll mention this again when we get to it, the sprite itself will be resized to match the dimensions of the image. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's add a bunch of stuff now. So you may be thinking, wow, that's a whole lot of variables I have to make if we have to stick one into every image. And you're right, that would be a lot. But what we can do is use an array and a for loop. Those two things are going to make our lives so much easier. I do this anytime I have to load up a lot of files or do any kind of repetitive task. So, well, we're going to say let, we'll say slime idle equal an empty array, and let, I'm going to call mine slime move equal an empty array. So basically we're just going to store each frame in an index of this array, and you don't have to make two separate ones. I just figured it would be, for me at least, looking at it, would be easier to see, okay, here's all the frames for the idle animation, here's all the ones for the move animation, and we can adjust that as needed. So inside of preload, all I'll do is make a simple for loop. And what I'll do in this for loop is we'll say let I be assigned 0. I'm going to run this for as long as I is less than 4. Say I, we're going to increase it by 1 every loop. So the reason I picked these numbers specifically is because, well, it's fairly standard practice to start your for loop at 0. People can at me on that if they want. But, generally speaking, that's usually how you'll see it. That's why I recommend having your frame numbers start at 0, just to make it so I will match up with the for loop number. So if my students downloaded something that starts at 1, I kind of recommend just go ahead, rename it, change that number, and make it start at 0. It'll save you a lot of time. You can also tweak the for loop, so you can have I start at 1 and so on and so forth. and then I picked 4 because there's 4 frames. So if this started at 1, you'd have to pick, 1 and 5 in order to get everything in there. It's important to know a few things. One, if your for loop doesn't have enough iterations, it's just going to leave this image, the last image, off. And that's going to happen. If your for loop has too many iterations, you're going to run into errors because the file won't be there for it to find because it doesn't exist. So it's important that you have the right number of iterations in your for loop. And again, that's just based on how many frames you have. Another handy trick is that you can utilize a single for loop for as many animations that have the same number of frames as you want. And I'll indicate that in just a second. But let's start by adding this up. So we're going to start with the idle animation. So slime idle. And we're going to specifically look at the I index equals load image. Just like so. So again, we're going to look at specifically one index of the array, and that's going to be whatever I is. Where we're going to find this? Well, it's going to be the same process as before. So we're going to look in the images folder, the sprite Annie subfolder, and then since it's the idle animation, the idle subfolder, and then we give it the file name. So slime hyphen idle hyphen, and now we're going to do something interesting. So at this point, all of the images have the same file pathway right up until this point, but the number is the thing that changes. So I'm going to go still in the arguments here, but outside of the string, and we're going to say plus I plus, and then finish the string with dot .png to finish out the name. So what this will do is this will basically, I'm really summarizing here, take the beginning portion of the string, and then we're going to take whatever value I is, and then the last portion of the string, and combine it, the official word is concatenate, all of that into one larger string. So again, that's what's happening right here. As a side note, you can, in terms of image formats, most of them, if it displays on the internet, will work. I have the best luck with PNGs, JPEGs, and GIFs. Those are the ones that work the best for me, but I'll let you figure out exactly what you like or don't. Okay, let's just see if I can get most of this on the same line. And close enough. And from there, we can, well, load up all the image. We haven't done anything with it yet, but because all that's set up there, we don't have this error right here. Like I mentioned, we can use the same for loop to load up multiple animations, but again, it all depends on the amount of frames. So if one of your animations has more frames than another, you'll need a separate for loop for those. But since my slime animations here all have 4 frames, we can load up all of them in this collection just with a single for loop, which I like. Equals load image right there. And then again, it's pretty much the same thing. Images slash sprite Annie slash, now we're in the move folder slash slime hyphen move hyphen plus I plus dot png, just like that. And if you refresh it, we're not getting any errors because the computer was able to find all the files and load them up. Again, this part is not utilizing P5 play. Everything after this sentence will be using P5 play. So let's get these images onto the sprite right there. To do that, we have to first make a sprite, which I already have right here. But if you were kind of following along, you're going to need to have the P5 play library loaded and a sprite ready to go to do this. So once we've made a sprite, we don't have to worry about doing this in preload because we've already loaded up the images. We just have to talk to them. So we can talk to my sprite, and we're going to use a method called add Annie for add animation. And what we need to do is, first off, give the animation a label to use. So I'm going to call this one idle. And then every argument afterwards, we're just going to list out the frames we want to use. So we'll say slime idle, the name of that array we made at the top. We're going to look specifically at number 0. And slime idle index 1. Slime idle index 2. And last but not least, idle index 3. One thing to note is you can leave out, repeat, loop all these however you want. A lot of animations kind of loop on a similar point, but maybe yours doesn't. You need to repeat a frame every now and then. You just simply say, okay, and then display, slime idle 2 again. You can pick that from wherever. You can even pull a frame from another animation. Like this works. If you wanted to, that would be kind of weird in this situation, but pretty much you just list how, whatever images that you've loaded into the sketch that you need in the order that you need them. That's it. You get to decide all of that. So that's right there. And if we load this, boop, now you can kind of see right above my head, more or less, the sprite has been given the this animation. I mentioned this before, but the sprite has now kind of resized itself to match the dimensions of these images that we've used. So you may want to go ahead and say, talk to your sprite and set the scale property to be something. I'm going to make them twice as big, just so it's a little bit easier to see on the screen. So depending on what you need to do, you can scale it up or down. Just be aware that may affect the resolution of your image. All right, so we're almost there. We're just going to add up another animation and be able to swap in between them. So what we need to do is, load up another animation, and we can just basically copy and paste this right there. So a sprite can display as many animations as you want. They all just need a unique name, and we have to tell it what frames to use. So I'm just going to set up slime move. I'm going to look at 0, slime move 1, slime move 2, and slime move 3. Just like that. And we can, just set that right up. We'll set it here. You notice that the animation has changed. We can only display one animation at a time. And by default, our sprites in this version of P5 Play, this has changed from older versions, will display whatever the last added animation was by default. So if you add 6 of them in a row, it's going to display the last one that you added on top. It's not going to display, all of these at the same time, but it's going to pick and choose which one it wants to display. So in just a second, we're going to talk about how we can change the animations. But before that, we're going to hop over into some resource material. So there's some helpful things here with the P5 Play webpage. This is in the Learn tab, and I'll, like always, link to this in the description. But you can load animations just in general, and I've already looked at this page once, but we can attach them to the sprite, play around. There's a whole lot of stuff we can do. We can look at specific frames. We can rewind it. We can loop it. We can change them. All of that. I'm just trying to always have to press S. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. See, like that. And we're just attaching them to the sprite. And we can also animate groups of them as well. Anyways, but that's a very handy tool. One thing I will criticize them about, and this is a very light criticization, just because criticization, if that's a word, just because this is in active development. All right, things are changing and updating as we are talking about it, and just as we're going along. The add Annie method right here has some different ways it can work. It can this is load Annie, we want add Annie, but it's the same idea. And like, this is the extent of everything that's been made public about it. It's just saying we're gonna, here's this, here's a number, and that's it. Like, we look at animations, they don't talk about what that means in any significant way. If I headed over to the sprite in general and looked, at the animation things, we can change animation. Great, we can. Here's the stuff about the animation. It doesn't tell us anything about what this means. I can infer some stuff, but I don't know for sure because it hasn't been made public in the documentation in any meaningful way, and I don't want to tell you anything that's wrong. So this is part of the reason why I went about it this way. Because that's the way I know, but also I like the fine-tuning control I can set up. When they, release that information and make that public, cool, but for right now, that's literally, I showed you literally all there is on their web pages about it. There's nothing else. So that's a little bit of a frustration for me. So I'm kind of showing you some ways to work with that, but one thing that's very handy in the docs, if you head to the Sprite Animation tab, you can look at everything you can adjust with the Sprite animation. So you can adjust very specific things. You can stop them, start them, go to specific frames, toggle whether it loops, all of that kind of thing. It's very, very handy. You can more so probably with the properties set some of these, which is very handy. The one I use the most is frame delay. So basically this is the amount of frames that each image in the animation is displayed. So if we wanted to change it and basically speed up or slow down our images, all we would have to do is adjust the frame delay property. What we need to do first is give that animation a name so we can talk to it. So we'll say move Annie and idle Annie, just like that. And I'm just going to go right here and we'll say idle Annie equals this and move Annie equals that. So now if we wanted to slow this down, we could just say move Annie dot frame delay is equal to 6. So now P5 will wait 6 frames before swapping to the next image in the animation cycle. I picked 6 because the default is 4 frames, so anything less than 4 will speed it up, anything bigger than 4 will slow it down. But there's a whole bunch of stuff here you can explore on your own, depending on what you're looking to do. I'm not going to break down every single one. Okay, this is for real kind of the last step, and that's just swapping in between each of these animations. And there's different things that we can do, different ways we can do this. I'm going to do it just kind of very simply with a conditional statement. So, if something happens, we are going to do something. I'm going to utilize some stuff. This is going to be, I'm not going to break it down here. This is going to come from the video on sprites and input controls, so things like the keyboard and the mouse. So check out that video in the playlist in the description below if you have any questions about that and want to learn more about it. I'm 100% sure a link to that will also pop up in one of the cards at the top. So, check that out as well. But we'll say if keyboard dot pressing, if we're going to press and we want to move it up, we can do some things. So what we have to do is talk to my sprite or whatever you named yours, and we're going to say dot Annie dot ANI equals. and we're gonna assign it to be whatever the label we gave it here was. So equals move. I'm also move. I'm also gonna say my sprite dot velocity dot x equals 0 and my sprite dot velocity dot y equals -1. And this is going to be the core of the core of what we're going to build in order to swap between these two animations. So we'll just say else if, and instead of moving it up, we'll move it right. So we'll make this 1, this 0, else if we're moving it down, that's 0, that's 1, else if we're moving it left, and we'll move this -1, 0, and then I'm just going to add outside of that if key is pressed. Just for some quality of life stuff, check out that other video if you have questions about what I did just right here. So now we have all of that, and just to be redundant, why not? I'll say else else my sprite dot Annie goes back to idle, and then my sprite dot velocity dot x and my, if I could type, sprite dot velocity dot y equals 0. So I just kind of live coded without much explanation, being able to move the sprite up, down, left, and right. For each of these, we're going to swap the animation from the idle animation to the moving one. And then, whenever we let go of the key, we're going to stop the sprite from moving and change its animation back to idle. So let me just move my face out of the way so you can see the whole frame. Boop, there I go. And we'll hop back over here. So if I refresh this just to make sure everything's going, we've got our sprite. And if I'm moving it up, down, left, and right, you know, the animation has changed, but when I let go, it stops. This animation is fairly subtle, but you'll notice that right now the slime is fairly spherical, but as I move it forward, it's kind of become a little oblong to indicate that it's moving in that direction. One thing I'm still looking for doing is how to flip the sprites back and forth. That hasn't popped up in the being actively developed library, so that's going to actually be a separate video. The reason for that is because, let me just bring my camera back. There we are. The reason for that is because as we move the sprite forward, it works. But as we move it back, it looks, like it's Michael Jackson moonwalking across the canvas. If that's what you want, great. But that's not very common. Usually what happens when you are making and giving people these animation frames is that you only have kind of one left and right movement, and you just flip it over to make the sprite face the other direction. Again, at the time I'm recording this, that isn't being implemented like it previously was, so I'm waiting to see what the changes are, and then I'll come out with a follow-up video with that. But just to briefly reiterate everything we did, this is a little bit of a longer video. We have loaded up an external image into these files and folders right here. You can rename them however you need. set that up just like so. We've then loaded them into the sketch using the preload function and load image to find them and just put them somewhere in the sketch that we can access them. In the case, it's usually either a variable or an array to help group together a whole bunch. Then we added them both as animations, two separate ones to our sprite. I then made the sprite a little bit bigger because the sprite gets, renamed, resized and everything. We can adjust the property of each animation individually as needed. And then we can set the Annie property for animation to be the name of these animations that we gave it whenever we first made it, right there as a string, in order to swap it. So again, just to briefly reiterate, if I said, someone is at the front door. We're going to pause for just a second. All right, so through the magic of video editing, I am back. That's the problem with doing all of these things in my living room, is whenever people come up for stuff, sometimes they don't know I'm recording. But through the magic of video editing, we have skipped all of that. So just to reiterate briefly, again, we just have to set the Annie, A-N-I property to match whatever label we wanted to give it. So if I wanted to say if, my sprite dot mouse dot pressed, then my sprite dot Annie equals move, else my sprite dot Annie equals idle. We're gonna have the same kind of thing where when I click on the sprite, it presses holding. I haven't done the full video yet on the interactions. What have I goofed on? It's pressing. There we are. So check out the upcoming video, or it may release before this one, we don't know yet, about the keyboard and sprite animations. As I refresh this, why isn't this going? Sprite.mouse.pressing. Oh, I know why. It's because I'm an idiot. It was getting overwritten by the fact that I wasn't pressing any keys. So we're just going to comment that out, refresh that, and now when I click the sprite, it's changing its animation. And hopefully this might be a little bit easier to see. I can make my scale a little bit bigger. And then if I click the sprite, it changes animation, just like so. So again, we are just setting the Annie property to match whatever animation label we gave it when we added it to the sprite. That's what I wanted to do, and that turned into a whole complicated thing. So we'll comment this one out, and I think that we'll call it a day. So that's going to be it from me. If you enjoyed the video, you learned something, definitely consider like, comment, subscribing, all that YouTube stuff. It definitely helps out. With the next video that I'll be recording here, I'll be talking more about interacting with the sprite, being able to hit buttons, click the mouse, this kind of stuff that we were kind of hinting at towards the end. But that's going to be it for me, and I will see you all the next time that I see you. Bye.